Good evening, everyone. I'm speaking to you today from the Institute for Culture and Society, Western Sydney University, and from the lands of the Darug Nations, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Today, I'm back with the second lecture in the Institute for Culture and Society's Key Concepts lecture series. And today's concept is community. And it's really my pleasure to introduce Associate Professor George Morgan, who's going to deliver this lecture on behalf of us. He divides his time between the School of Humanities and Communication Arts and the Institute for Culture and Society. He's looked at parameters that redefine Islamophobia in Australia. And in the last 5 years or so, he's been exploring precarious work and the gig economy. So over to Professor Morgan.
Hi, my name's George Morgan, and I'm going to talk to you for the next half an hour about the idea of community. Just share screen here. Should be able to see the PowerPoint. Hopefully with me in a little box in the corner. Okay. This is a weird word, not a particularly useful word in a conceptual sense, doesn't really hold water, but a really important word because it's often used in political discourse in very slippery ways. Community seems like something we should all agree with, like fresh air, apple pie, and motherhood, but it's actually very difficult to pin down. It's also a word that is somewhat promiscuous. It is used by those who are seeking to advance particular interests and agendas with reference to the weight of support from a nominal community. So it's very important as a term in a political sense. It can be used to promote social change. We talk about grassroots community action as being the sort of engine of progressive social change. But we also very often hear the term community values. And when that term is used, it's very often to try and prevent change, prevent or slow down the kinds of changes that may involve a challenge to the moral norms that have prevailed to that point. So the term community, I think, is most useful in looking at political discourse. Before I get into looking at the concept in depth, I want to draw your attention to a sort of lost territory in sociology. During the 1960s and 70s, there was a subdiscipline of sociology which was known as community studies and was directed at making sense of and understanding neighbourhood communities in various settings in both city areas and in rural and regional areas. But it was particularly a method used to explore the emerging suburban communities as cities began to build out beyond the old inner cities. And as new communities were being formed, there was a kind of a preoccupation with understanding social life in these new areas. However, the field of community studies has sort of disappeared from the radar I think it's got something to do with the rise of digital communication, the uh, the way in which the field of globalization studies has, to some extent, usurped the local, but I think also we've seen a concern about understanding the connection of the local with the global. But that kind of ethnographic work in small communities to sort of understand the nature of local social relations, that is less central now in the social sciences than it was perhaps 50 years ago. All right, so getting on to the main kind of ideas I want to explore today. I want to give you 3 ideas of community here. And I'm going to talk most about the second and third ideas, but I want to introduce you to approaches to community that are not necessarily commensurable. They may be in some respects. First of all, what we might call the structural idea of community, communities based on objective criteria. The idea that being part of a particular, living in a certain area, or being a member of a cultural minority group, or being part of a certain age demographic means you are part of the community. And these sorts of definitions of community are the sort of stock in trade of public policy and of academic work that seeks primarily to inform public policy. So the term community in a structural sense has less to do with people's experience and identification with community than in the second idea of community, which is the cultural notion of community, the notion that it is in and through our shared culture, the language we share, the symbolic systems, the beliefs, the rituals and practices, the narratives that we tell, that our sense of common purpose and destiny, our sense of being bonded to others, is achieved in and through culture. So that's the second idea of community I want to talk about. The third relates much more to the notion of community as a kind of production of political rhetoric and official discourse. And I'm going to end the lecture pod that I'm giving you by discussing critically those claims to represent community and the interests of community. So on the first definition, that the structural definition of community argues that we cannot only look at modern societies in their mass form, in their totality. We have to understand the social groups that are nested within modern societies that cut across the broad bonds of citizenship. Now, group memberships can be defined, as I said, a number of ways, and it's not necessarily important for the purposes of public policy that you identify as belonging to a particular group. You may feel that your religious affiliation is unimportant to you as a social subject, as a citizen, but those who are framing policy may see religious communities as very important in terms of, the social policies that are being developed. Communities in this structural sense can be measured demographically. This is what is done in the census to some extent. It's done through opinion polls, and it's done through particularly through quantitative social research. And as I said, such work informs social policies and can help to shape the political platforms of parties in liberal democracies. The problem with such categories is that they can often be reified, that we can treat as concrete certain ideas about groups, about communities, which says very little about the way in which people feel about being objectively a member of that community. So, to some extent, I think we should always treat such categories as provisional, because there is nothing in critical social science, as opposed to positivist social science, that says that any category is necessarily always important in terms of understanding, for example, power and inequality in society. Categories are always provisional. All right, so the second idea of community is that we construct communities primarily through cultural forms, through linguistic and non-linguistic symbolic systems, through signs, through rituals, through embodied practices, through moral values, and through the myths of communal belonging. These things help to cement social bonds. But it's important to qualify this statement in two ways. Firstly, there is nothing fixed about culture. Culture, as we know, is a process that is constantly in flux. It is made and remade in and through human communication. And very often you will hear community leaders who purport to speak on behalf of those who share a culture. You will hear those people try to anchor culture to tradition, to suggest that that culture is to some extent impervious to the influences from the modern world. But we know as scholars of culture that that's not the case. So it's important, I think, to be suspicious of those claims about what a culture is. It's also important to recognise that when a group of people share a culture and they need that culture to communicate, they don't necessarily share objective social situations. That power operates within communities despite what they have in common culturally. So we should always be, I think, a little bit skeptical of absolutist definitions of community. So just to bear in mind then that if we hold a view of culture that is more than just a kind of national ethnic background, or the sense of a kind of enduring primordial culture, if culture is more than that, if culture is what we all do in the course of our everyday lives, all of us are symbolically creative, then we can begin to see that the idea of community as tied to a fixed culture is actually a form of closure, and we should be critical of that. So the third notion of community is the idea of community as a sort of artifact of politics. And we used to use this word quite a lot in the late 20th century when reading the writings of Louis Althusser, a French Marxist philosopher, who talked about the interpolation of citizens in and through political rhetoric, the hailing of people to particular positions through ideology. The idea that politics is always about constructing the constituency that stands behind you. And from a Foucauldian perspective, every utterance that seeks to sort of summon up a community is simultaneously evoking a social group, eliciting that group for a political purpose. It's seeking to represent that group, but also to exercise power and authority over it. And I want to draw your attention to the writings of Weberian sociologist Rogers Brubaker, who in his book Ethnicity Without Groups challenged the idea that ethnic communities are socially circumscribed, differentiated, and homogeneous. He used this term groupism to suggest that we are very often naive and simplistic in listening to and believing the political rhetoric that seeks to draw on the authority of and the power of the group that stands behind you. Now, when talking about communities, we can't ignore the idea of the national community, and probably one of the best known works on the culture of nationhood is Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, in which he explored the emergence of the sense of belonging to a modern national community in parts of Asia. And he argued that in order to feel ourselves as part of this larger imagined community, in order to move beyond the face-to-face traditional bonds, to have the sense that there are others who will always remain strangers to us, but who are part of our imagined community. That requires not just a constitution, a declaration of, liberal citizenship after the French Revolution, for example. It requires that we have the cultural resources to imagine those broader ties with distant others. And Anderson identified newspapers and novels as cultural forms that encourage that form of imagination. In looking at decolonizing movements throughout the 20th century, and indeed even today, we need to think about this idea of imagined communities, because very often colonized peoples have to move beyond their traditional local, perhaps tribal allegiances, to imagine themselves as part of a wider decolonizing movement, challenging the imperial power of Britain, France, wherever, moving to occupy the space of the nation that's, to some extent been created by this colonial power. So it's a complicated transition there from tradition to modernity. At this point, I want to draw your attention to the Marxist tradition and the contribution of Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, who took Marxism into the cultural realm as probably nobody did prior to Gramsci, recognizing that in order to obtain the consent of the people, the nation state needs to do more than just coerce them, dominate them, threaten them. It must fulfill a cultural role. And Gramsci saw the articulation of this idea of the national community, the people of the nation, as itself a kind of conjuring trick, because all capitalist societies are inherently unstable. And so you need the state to articulate the interests of the ruling class as being in the interests of the people as a whole, in order to short circuit dissatisfaction and resistance to this unequal set of relations. And the idea of hegemony is this notion of building a kind of broad popular support around an unequal political project. Now, there's a paradox that's very central to Australian nationhood, and indeed all supposedly multicultural society, in that we acknowledge the divisibility of imagined communities and recognize ethnic communities as effectively as actors within a pluralistic democracy. So modern Australian nationhood embraces ethnic communities, by contrast with more assimilationist imagined communities. For example, France, in which national belonging is seen as almost indivisible. But it's important that we recognize multiculturalism for what it is, and to see that the kind of community belonging that multiculturalism is talking about is a folkloric belonging. in which only the exotic and appealing aspects of a community culture, the cuisine, the costume, the dance, the performance of traditional arts, but anything that clashes with, that affronts the white nation's dominant moral economy, anything that is dissonant with the broader Anglo understanding of the nation and the imagined community, those things are not acceptable as expressions of communal belonging in Australian multiculturalism. Now, it's important that we see the political role that that the representatives of minority communities play in the wider political process, because this is not just about cultural expression. There is also, I think, very much the acknowledgement of the role of minorities as sort of pressure groups within Australian democracy. And indeed, the way in which the Australian state operates is very much according to corporatist norms, such that communities are called upon and communities themselves lobby politicians in and through their status as so-called community representatives. And so I'm not deriding this. It's important. It's certainly better than denying anyone from minority communities a seat at the table. But we also need to think critically about those who claim to represent particular groups in society, including ethnic groups, because very often those people peddle a particular version of community and community morality. Stanley Cohen, British sociologist, in the mid-20th century, talked about moral entrepreneurs. And very often you'll see people speaking in public about the communities they represent in a way that seeks to close things down. And they sometimes offer a patriarchal vision of community and communal morality. So just again, stressing the point, which is made by many cultural theorists, including, as this slide suggests, Stuart Hall, Nina Glick-Sheila, and others, the idea that communities are fluid and the culture of those communities are fluid. They don't necessarily adhere to ancient tradition and traditional values. Young people, for example, can very often challenge the ossified traditions and values. They can very often come up with their own account of the world that is not necessarily consistent with that of their elders. Okay, I want to speak about a trend in political philosophy from the kind of late 20th century. A range of theorists saw themselves as communitarians, and communitarianism held that we've gone too far in the direction of individual liberties under liberal democracy, to the point where we have lost sight of community values which maybe are difficult to incorporate, and the individual has lost a sense of responsibility to communities. Now, communitarianism is often communitarian philosophers are kind of vague about what makes up a community. But the important thing is here that it's a challenge to the kind of atomized individualism of liberal democracy. An example of the operation of communitarianism, Aboriginal people with very strong and particular political and moral claims that their law operated well before Europeans arrived in this land, that law was basically completely wiped away by the system of British law, common law, and then eventually statute law in this country. And that in order to kind of recognise and empower Aboriginal people, that certain aspects of traditional law should be allowed to operate in relation to some crimes, situations of social conflict, and so on. And indeed, there are situations and places, particularly in the Northern Territory, I think, where some limited operation of traditional law is allowed. Opponents of this argue that there's no way of safeguarding individuals within communities against arbitrary power and injustice. That if you have a universalist set of values that you seek to enshrine in a law that applies equally to everyone, then you can protect people who may otherwise be victimized. So this is a complicated argument, and I'm not entirely sure where I stand, but there's a danger with communitarianism that you fail to recognize the kinds of hierarchies and power relations that operate within communities that mean that some values are foregrounded while others are marginalized or suffocated. All right, so this has been a discussion of, I guess, quite what I would call a chaotic abstraction. Community is not the most rigorous concept, and our interest in it is not one of trying to refine a certain rigorous definition of community. Community is used by both scholars and within public discourse generally in a very loose way. What I've tried to suggest here is that both the structural and the discursive definitions of community can clash with community as a cultural formation. And I've argued that when we talk about a cultural formation, we're talking about much more than just the inherited culture that has been passed on through the generations. We're talking about much more than just trying to preserve something from the past. We're talking about culture here as something that combines, in Raymond Williams' terms, the residual and the emergent. I've argued that multiculturalism is a certain kind of communal discourse which produces a certain version of representativeness, and that we should always be a little bit skeptical of those who claim to speak for communities. We should always bear in mind that in order really fully to understand those communities, we need a deeper um, excavation of the culture of community. And we should always be very skeptical of the idea that people identify with the communities which they are objectively members of. You may speak Arabic and come from um, uh, the Lebanese community, for example, but it's not necessarily that you identify with that community in a political sense. You may only be loosely attached to Lebaneseness. And so those who purport to speak for you, their claims always have to be scrutinized closely, I guess is what you're saying. So in just the final point that we should always recognize that the rights of minority communities should always be within liberal democracies protected against the tyranny of the majority, right? This is a cornerstone of most versions of liberal philosophy. But the challenge here is in reconciling individual and group rights. And what I think I'd argue is that in a world where global tensions are increasing, where more and more people are turning to xenophobic and nativist expressions of national belonging, the quest to safeguard those minorities, to protect communities and their right to practice culture, that quest is becoming increasingly difficult. Okay, thanks very much.